So Pia Andrews is, many of you will probably know her or have read some of her work already, but I'll introduce her and all the same have a go. Pia is an open government, digital transformation and data geek who's been trying to make the world a better place for 20 years by working with the public sector. She works on programs that transform public services, policies and culture through greater transparency, democratic engagement, citizen-centric design, open data, emerging technologies, and real pragmatic innovation in the public sector and beyond. Pia is currently taking something of a public sector sabbatical, but has done lots of work in the public sector in the past in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada as well. Worked for decades in the public sectors in those countries and done lots of exciting work. So I'll leave it at that, but welcome, Pia.
Thanks so much.
So you change your slides there with the green arrow.
Thank you so much, Chris. Kia ora, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And I do want to just up front, I've been back in Australia for a year, so I'm actually going to just use the parlance of my country and just say I want to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners and custodians of this land, and not just the leaders, emergent and past, but also all of those wonderful knowledge systems that we all draw from and learn on and come together on every day. I started this paper. This talk actually has its roots in a paper that I published a couple of months ago. And I wrote the paper actually from a moment of rage. And I wanted to be upfront with that. I have worked with lots of people inside and outside of government, and it is still amazing to me how many people, even inside of government, don't understand or have never been taught the special context of government. So I have been in, very informed and robust conversations with people who say, but there's no special context to government. I mean, companies have to be accountable to their shareholders. How's that any different? And I just don't have enough face palms for that conversation. But so what I wanted to do with the paper was be able to say, look, here is the special context of government. Here's what that means in the terms of how you need to design, manage, regulate, maintain your systems, services, policies, regulation, legislation, such in government. But and then I used the use case of AI-based, machine learning specifically based ADM systems as a novel use case. But the paper was written in a way that should be able to be applied to anything that we do in government. But I want to use that use case because of the amount of artificial intelligence I'm seeing being used and all of the hysteria around it, which quite often misses the point. So I'm going to be looking at a couple of big problems around this. What I'm hoping for is a pretty robust conversation out of it. And one of the key things which has been brought up in a couple of the speakers before is that trust is not something taken, it's not something asked for, it's not something sought. It is and only ever has been something that's earned. So the key takeaway from this whole thing is how do we build and operate in a more trustworthy way? And of course, machine learning is probably our biggest test in this respect. So the first thing I just want you to consider is, and I basically say this at every talk that I give because I think it's easy to forget. It's very easy to get into the habit of saying, how can I just work within the context that I'm in? How can I just tweak the edges of the construct that I'm in? How can I, the system's too big to change, so how do I just make the little changes? And it's just worth reminding ourselves every so often, I try to remind myself this every week, that we invented all of this. We invented all of these systems, these structures, these programs, this software, this function center, this thing that we call government. We actually invented it all as humans. We can reinvent it. We can make choices to say, let's leave behind things that are not quite working. Let's take forward things that are meaningful and important. Let's create new ways of solving problems. And if you can embrace that really in your soul, it's both very empowering, also a bit scary, because then if you don't take action to change things, then you are part of keeping it. But it's a very important thing to remember, I think, and so I like to introduce my talks with it. So trust is important. I'm not going to go into why. I think we all understand it. But one of the key things about trust in the context of government is that people are struggling with it every day. So this is a very silly cartoon I put, but I think it's helpful. people don't know what's true. You've got someone selling, this is pure organics, it's for sale. And it's like, well, how do I know if it's true? People are seeing lots of content. Babies should be taxed, someone eating something they shouldn't eat or whatever. It's very hard to differentiate between what's real and what's fake anymore. People get caught up in conversations about what's truth, but also what's authentic. It might be authentically untrue. It might be authentically untrue, but being able to identify the source is really important. How do you know what's genuine? How do you know if you're being gamed? There's so many uses of technology. How do you know that the entire supply chain of the software, of the data, of the decision-making mechanisms, of all aspects of that system, how do you know they haven't been tampered? And I think the big final one for me is how do people understand, interact with, have explained to them and be able to appeal decisions that affect them. So I want to share a very real story here in Aotearoa. A friend of mine lives in a small country town in New Zealand, and she is known to be that person that works in government. So everyone in the community goes and asks her for advice, and has a coffee and sort of bends her ear. And this older Māori lady, a very religious lady, was just having a catch-up coffee with her and let her know that the application for a liver transplant had come back negative. And my friend was like, oh no, are you okay? And the lady's response was, oh, well, I guess this is my time. I've had a good life. I've got, I've been able to live to see my grandchildren, so I'll be fine. And my friend was horrified. And so she said, but did they give you an explanation why? And the woman's answer is something I think we all need to really sit with. Her answer was, but government don't get it wrong. My friend said, yeah, nah. And so she assisted this woman to do an appeal, and she did actually get a different answer. The woman has now had the successful transplant, is still alive. It's not ever to say that anyone's fallible or infallible. Like, nothing is that, dichotomous. But it is to say that we need the mechanisms that easily explain and make it easier for people to appeal, because sometimes it is actually a matter of life and death. So trust and power are interlinked. Trust leads to, and public trust in government is what gives us stability. When people lose trust, and they can lose trust for any reason, they can lose it because the last service that they had was terrible, because the person they saw at the front line was, horrible. They could lose it because a decision was wrong. They could lose it because some data was lost, or they could lose it because they were issued a fine for money that they never owed them. And I'm now quoting Australians. But trust, when you lose trust, that leads to all kinds of instability. And we saw through COVID, the ability to implement government policies around the world had very varied results. So everything that we can do to build trust is absolutely critical, because everything that we do is then seen through the lens of how legitimate a person perceives it to be, based on their trust of government. So the key principle here is to move from asking for trust to being trustworthy. So trust has 3 ingredients, and believe me, we'll get to artificial intelligence specifically in a moment. But in trying to actually define trust very clearly, trust really has 3 aspects to it. You trust someone or an entity or an organisation if they exhibit these 3 things. If they operate in good faith, however you determine that to be, if they operate with integrity, and if they meet your expectation. That third one is really about context. So, when a person says one thing and does something else, obviously that goes against good faith. Integrity, you need to be able to demonstrate that that you're doing what you say you do. That you're doing it correctly, that you're doing it accurately, that you are within the law, that you're within your areas and domains of responsibility. Being able to actually show that, and expectations is critical as well, because what a person expects from a company is completely different than what they expect from government. This last one always amuses me, because people quite often talk about, why are people happy to share their data with Google? Well, Google can't take their kids or incarcerate them or fine them. Yes, they can do all kinds of annoying things, or sometimes terrible things, and sometimes selling data, and there's things that they can do, but they don't have the specific monopoly of violence that the state has, which is, not a philosophical thing. That is literally the definition of the state, right? So trust has to be earned. And if we take those 3 concepts, then we need to have good faith in government and the public sector. We need to be able to have high and demonstrable integrity of government, and we need to be able to meet those public expectations of government. How do we do that? Good faith can be through systemic and measurable commitment to human-centred, humane outcomes, strong governance, shared governance, open participation, etc. Integrity can be demonstrated through having systems that are demonstrably and measurably lawful, accurate, assured, consistently applied, appealable, etc., explainable. And of course, meeting expectations is about reflecting not just people's needs, but their values, not just respecting the want, but the dignity of the person's experience, about actively seeking what the impact is so that we can identify and mitigate harm, and being transparency and operating within our authorities. So that special context of government, we have a legal context we work within, moral, human, democratic, and power context. The key thing here is that quite often the people implementing artificial intelligence are over in IT or a contractor and are completely separate from the people that think about all this stuff. So that functional segmentation we've got in all of our departments has actually made it impossible for us to build systems and services and the implementation of policies and laws that actually meets the original intent, that recognise the original intent and builds it in as part of the design. So if we think about the legal context, everything we do in government is supposed to be compliant with administrative law, at least in Westminster-based countries, right, which is primarily where I've worked. Administrative law basically says you need to be able to demonstrate how you've operated within your authorities. And yet, so many business systems in government take the law and then operational policy people will interpret that into business requirements, take operational policy, interpret that into business requirements, mash it up into a series of documents that are thrown over the fence to IT, and they're told to just implement. Where's the traceability? Where's the explainability? And where's the delineation between the law and the operational policies is a very interesting question. When you have machine learning-based systems, particularly machine learning-based decision-making systems, which I'll come to, you now have not only lost the ability to explain the outcome, but more importantly, you've actually started to contradict rule of law, because the same input is going to get a different output as the machine is learning over time. So we've now just gone well outside of our domain, our responsibilities, and the trust that people put in us and the expectations people have. Of course, from a moral context side of thing, and also you've got this beautiful law in New Zealand, which, by the way, I'm trying to copy and replicate in other places. Even if it is underutilized here, it's going to get increasingly important. Section 23 of OIA. Who knows what that is? Oh, no one! Okay, yeah, Nadia. Hey, Nadia. Okay, this is the coolest piece of law, and I show it off everywhere around the world. So, you ready? It is literally the right to an explanation. It's a little piece of law as part of your OIA that says that any person can ask any department for an explanation, and the department must, by law, provide it to them. And the explanation has to include under what authorities, with what information the decision was made, and a whole bunch of other stuff. It's quite prescriptive, actually, in what you have to provide. So it begs the question, how is explainability not a business requirement for every government system that creates a decision or that actually produces an output or an action? So it's a very, very interesting sort of outcome there. Human context, we are expected to actually deliver good human outcomes. But how do you know if you're getting good human outcomes if you're only measuring success by the performance of the service? What's the uptime, what's the downtime, how much is the cost per transaction, how much savings have we had, etc. Even then, if you measure the policy outcome, you can be in a situation where you've got great performance, great CX, the people think it's a good service, and you're meeting the policy intent, but what's the impact on quality of life? Actually implementing quality of life indicators and then measuring them on an ongoing basis so that you can tie them back to policy impact gives you the opportunity to then mitigate and address harm. So let's keep moving on. I have made 5 categories of artificial intelligence just for the purpose of this conversation, and I think that these are helpful for you to take away in your planning, in your policy, in your design and strategies around the use of artificial intelligence. We've been showcasing this and talking about this with a few legal organisations as well, which has been really helpful. The first one is basic analytics. A lot of people use artificial intelligence for the purpose of analysis, for patterns, for identifying, new information, new context, running some machine learning across your metadata or images and such for the purpose of research is one use case. The second one is being able to, hold on a second. This is where I got to bring my notes up. The second one is automation, of course. So there's a lot of just using AI for the purpose of automating something. It's not clever. It's not necessarily even machine learning. Sometimes it is, but usually it's about just automating something as it is. The third one, and yes, that's a very disturbing picture because the third one is about artificial intelligent systems that basically just mash up content. They say, here's 2 successful videos on YouTube. One happens to be a Peppa Pig video and one happens to be a awful violent thing. And it's like, well, I'll get lots of clicks. And, because machines are basically motivated by whatever the system that they're in, and clicks is the currency of YouTube. And so it's mashing those things up. And kids do click through and it's pretty awful and terrifying, which is why YouTube is banned in my house. So, but that's generating deepfakes at a rate that we will never be able to keep up with. It's generating all kinds of issues around copyright and IP and all kinds of stuff. The fourth one is automated decision-making systems, and there's lots of examples of that, whether it's a business system producing a, eligibility for a benefit, right through to self-driving cars. There's lots of things that are decision-making systems that are either taking a decision or taking an action. And the final one are what I call personal AIs. The Alexas, the Siris, these are very simple in some respects, uses of artificial intelligence, but they are interesting to consider because the personal AIs give us opportunities to do all kinds of augmentation of the workforce. This talk is not about that, so I'm going to skip over that, but I've left the slide in there for you to think about later. Today, I really want to focus on automatic decision-making because it's with automatic decision-making, particularly machine learn-based automated decision-making, that you have the challenges of being compliant to administrative law, to rule of law, etc. There are and have always been rules-based systems, automatic decision-making systems, where you can actually say, here's the rule, it's applied, and now I've got a traceability of the rule to the decision. There have been those systems forever, but what I'm seeing increasingly is people are replacing those rules-based systems with machine learning-based systems where they take all of the history and then the software is creating a presumption about the application of the rule, which then changes over time. And of course, you've all heard the stories about trying to then get clean data, trying to deal with bias in data, all those things. And what I've seen and what's been quite worrying is a lot of the ethical AI approaches that keep coming out, and there's so many frameworks, basically seem to come down to only 2 strategies. Principles, so, go and have a good old think about these things, which, gets very variable outcomes and is not exactly measurable. Or, and in some cases, human in the loop. Now, I would argue that if we look at the, grand history of humans through our 200,000 years or so of evolution, that humans in the loop have not always made the wisest, most ethical decisions. So even the presumption that a human in the loop will necessarily result in an ethical outcome is quite dangerous as well. But how do we go beyond that? The reason is because ADM is probably the most in need of regulating and getting standards and the consistency of application and how we use them. So is there a problem to solve? Well, yes, there's a lot of computer says no happening at the moment where either the end user, the citizen of a service is getting an answer that they can't understand and it's hard to get an answer. The frontline staff member is being given an answer from the system that they can't explain. If a person does query it, it's going to a review team who don't even bother trying to interrogate the system. They just go and do a manual review and then give a different answer in some cases. So there is that issue of people feeling disenfranchised because, like, at all areas, at all parts of that supply chain, because just computer says no, right? That lack of explainability obviously is a challenge, and that's a real issue at all ends of that as well. Garbage in, garbage out, anything which is machine learning based, you're going to get garbage in, you're going to have gaps in the data going in, and no amount of data governance or cleaning is going to fix the fact that you're going to create and generate whatever's come from before into the future and project that forward. There are issues around human impacts not being what the systems are being trained on. They're being trained on, I want to find a 10% efficiency. Well, that's easy. We've all seen the movies, the various movies where machines go like, oh, well, clearly humans are the problem here. We're seeing that every day. And yet the only way to fix that is to create an incentive system where even an AI will actually say, oh, I need to make sure that I balance this for quality of life. Otherwise, I'm not winning. So introducing those incentive systems, introducing those human impacts as part of the measurement framework is critical. Otherwise, money will always be balanced over people. And I've already spoken about human in the loop and principles. So I would suggest that there's 4 pillars for AI, ADM-based systems, but also for any 21st century trust infrastructure. You need to have traceability and accountability. You need to be able to demonstrate and measurably demonstrate human outcomes. You need to plan for machines as users. It's not all going to be people. And when we're building regulatory frameworks that assume when the person does the wrong thing, we're going to catch them and we're going to do these things. If the person doing the wrong thing is a machine who doesn't care about jail or fines or any of those things, then we need to make sure that our regulatory systems and our services are presuming machines as users, both to enable positive potential things like your AI helpers, but also to be able to mitigate negative ones. And of course, creating the thing that you never hear technologists talk about usually, but it's so critical. You need to have a culture where every person, where the expertise in your organization can be heard. Because there are many projects where everyone inside the organization knew there was a problem, but there was no escalation mechanism. There was no way to listen to it. There was no way to be heard. There was no way to fly the flag short of, going off and whistleblowing and then all of the challenges and issues that entails for the individual. So actually creating those safe and ethically motivated structures, workplaces, culture is actually one of the most critical enablers for ethical AI and for building public trust. So traceability requires something to trace to. I think that at least some of you know, and particularly Nadia at the back's been progressing quite significantly as well, the concept of taking at least prescriptive legislation and regulation, having it available as a reference model in code so that at best, your automatic decision-making systems can draw on the rules and use them as part of the deliberation process. At worst, even if you insist on wanting to use a machine learning-based ADM system, you should be able to test the output against the law to make sure it is actually legal. So in either case, you need to have rules as code. Appealability requires an accessible record to appeal. So Canada now has a new policy that says that every single decision made about a person, the explanation of that decision has to be made available to that person at the same moment, which is quite proactive, isn't it? And that makes it easy for that person to keep the record, to be able to appeal it if it's wrong, to be able to question it. It's actually quite good. Auditing requires real-time monitoring and escalation. You can't just have a policy and then years later do a post-policy implementation review anymore because the world moves too fast for that. So actually identifying the policy and the human impacts up front, measuring them as you go, and then feeding that back into the policy is going to be critical. And of course, you can't do no harm unless you can measure for harm. Human-centered requires not just some design methods and some human impact measures, but also the ability for public to participation. It was a fantastic talk just before now. Thank you so much. Having representation of different needs in the room for the consultation rather than putting out a paper and hoping people can respond to it is critical. And that means actively drawing in those lenses, those views into not just the service design delivery, not just the AI design delivery, but also the policy design delivery. Assume machines as users. Every single one of those is a machine-generated face, by the way. And every single one of them you can actually drag up and down for all kinds of different things, and it is horrifying. But the safe and ethically motivated teams. Do your teams feel safe, supported, valued? Do they have time and space to think, to review, to permission to raise things? This is the really important part that absolutely needs to be raised up, which means a shift to how senior leadership actually manages, rather than managing people, rather than leading people, lifting people up and supporting them is going to be critical. So that I'm seeing this shift in several other governments, a shift away from micromanagement, managerialism, and towards servant leadership. And that, I think, is a real thing that could be a focus here. And, of course, participatory governance. So I'm going to give you a couple of other tools to help in this space. And I'm sorry, there's a bunch of words on this, and my apologies for that, but I've written it so that you can take it away and play with it. These would be the questions I would be designing an ADM system around. How do you audit and monitor decisions, accuracy, and legal authority in real time? In real time. These are things that you should be able to say. Well, I can demonstrate in this way. And if they're built into your actual design principles, if they become effectively epics for your backlog, however you go about building these user requirements or business requirements, however you want to frame it in your particular organization, these just become part of the process from the start. How does someone, the person affected by it, know, understand, challenge, appeal, decision, and action? It's worth saying that the Australian government ethical AI framework is equally rubbish, but they've done something very, very strange, which I just find fascinating. There's a principle in there about transparency and explainability. And the way it is actually defined, the way they've actually defined it is that a government department using an AI system needs to tell the person that they're using an AI system. That's it. Apparently that's sufficient. So yeah, that of course is being kind of shredded at the moment, and people are having some good input into that conversation. And there's going to be a major AI review happening in Australia just over the next little while because of the biometric stuff that has happened there as well. So that's going to be worth keeping an eye on. How do you know whether it's having a impact or what impact it's having? Fair, positive, negative, etc. How do you ensure independent oversight? I've seen departments establish systems and then the systems be fundamentally flawed in some way or another, and then say, oh, so we'll just get the law changed to make that acceptable. And then even worse, say, but it's all right, we already have governance in place, so we can just expand our current governance arrangements. It's like, well, but your current governance got you to a point of having illegitimate systems, so maybe we should rethink your governance. Anyway, how would you detect, respond to, and implement change? Which is really important. We need to design everything we do with continuous change in mind. If you're not able, and part of your, again, your business requirements or your backlog should include a whole bunch of change examples. If this change happens, how will that flow through? Not just the system, but the operating model. And that then helps you then design for continuous change. And the final one is very, is a little bit meta, but so important. How would you operate in a way the public would consider trustworthy? Each different jurisdiction and each different culture and each individual department will need to answer this question differently. Because the fact is that what it takes for the public to trust an intelligence agency is going to be different to what it takes to trust a Department of Environment. It's going to be different to what it takes to trust Service New South Wales. Is going to be different. So actually engaging with the public around what would it take you to trust us? And just as a quick example for you, I ran a session about data, privacy, sovereignty, federated stuff in Australia, and I had a whole bunch of very senior departmental folk in the room from across all of government, and we were talking about data provisions and such. And I just, on the spur of a moment, I said, look, I'm just going to ask a question. What would it take you to trust me, to give me your data, your kids' data, your parents' data? What would it take? And they're like, oh, all right. And they wrote down a whole bunch of stuff, right? And then we shared it, and it was all the sort of things you'd expect. I'd need to know how it's being used. I'd need to know it's not being commercialized, I'd need to know it's protected. And then we moved on with the rest of the session where they all said all the things that they were doing in their programs to protect data. And I just pointed out, much to their absolute horror, that none of the things they said they would need as an individual was covered by the programs they had in their departments. It was just a good insight. So it can't be seen as a compliance activity, but actually part of the initial design. And I'm getting a wind up, so I'll just be really quick. These are the new ideas I think that you need for trustworthy ADM. You need legislation as code, regulation as code, either to incorporate or to test against. You need algorithmic transparency. The algorithmic impact assessment in Canada is excellent because it gives a tiered approach to risk. Your risk is based on several different things, but most of all on the potential impact it could have. And then the level of governance is very light for things of low risk and very high for things of high risk. That tiered approach to risk is critical, and I can't recommend it enough. Design for proactive explanation, design for participatory policy. Adopt, even if it's just 2 indicators to start, a human impact approach to measurement of success, and start to look at what real-time design-led and machines as users impacts have. So finally, again, just to remind you, we did invent it, we can invent it all again. And the final question I have for you all is, if we don't, who will? I'll leave it there. Thank you all so much. Oh, we're doing Q&A, aren't we? Ooh.
Great. Well, I've left my microphone behind.
I have one here.
All right. If any of you need to head to another room for a session, feel free to just whiz over. Otherwise, we'll ask a few questions. We don't actually have questions yet, but I assume they'll be coming through. We do have a joke, however, which I'll read out. I assume this is from Dave at the back. I asked Alexa to tell a joke. The reply was, "Sorry, I wasn't listening. I thought I would give you some privacy." Then she said, "Would you like to hear another joke?"
We actually asked our OK Google. We said, "Do you know Siri?" And its response was, "Yeah, us personal assistants all hang out together." It was okay. I'm out.
And we've got.
Sorry. Oh, that's a good idea because we all hated Clippy, didn't we?
Clippy as well. We've got another one here from Pim. How can we bring regulatory design and system implementation together? I think he might be online.
Oh, cool. Hey, Pim. And it's totally a Dorothy Dixer because this is something Pim and I have been working on for years, right? So one of the things that I'm a little out of the loop in Aotearoa, to be honest, with where things are at. But certainly in Australia, and absolutely in Canada, the entire regulatory sector have started realising that the way that they draft and implement and monitor is not working. It's slow, it's out of date. By the time you put a change into place, the system around you is already adapted to it. The concept of risk-based assessment is helpful for some things, but because it's become the go-to and everything comes down to, we can only regulate the highest risk things, you've got a real problem. So starting to bring some of those additional ideas like market transparency. If you ask people to do a self-assessment, publish the self-assessment because their customers, competitors and staff will certainly help keep them honest, as it were. And it only takes a few embarrassments for people to be nudged in the right direction of the regulatory impact. But of course, one of the things I'm sure Pim is hinting at is better rules. If you actually get a multidisciplinary approach to your regulatory and legislative design, and then actually isomorphically, which means just simultaneously draft the legislation or regulation as well as what a reference implementation might look like, you have a chance of identifying and making very clear what needs to be clear. You also have a chance of testing whether it's going to have the likely intended input. And of course, if you have consumers of those rules in the room at the same time, you have a better chance of getting something that'll be implemented how you expect. So there's a great speech that I might share the link of online from one of the heads of policy in Canada that basically says the way that they've done Westminster-based policy advice to government for, hundreds of years hasn't fundamentally changed, and it worked well for quite some time, but with the internet it's gone out the window. So they're having to completely change and shift to how they do policy advice in a more agile, iterative, evidence-based and continuously changing way.
Great. Did you say that was Canada?
Fantastic speech. I'll share it.
Yeah, there'll be a chance for all the presenters to send out any slides or notes that they want to share after the conference, so look out for that. Hope next week, maybe that's a stretch, possibly the week after. And just one last question here. So should the list also include server issues? For example, where the cloud system is based. It could be a server in the US holding sensitive New Zealand data, but vulnerable to their Cloud Act.
So the list I did was about specifically trying to design trustworthy ADM in terms of how it operates. There's clearly going to be a whole bunch of other stuff. How are you supporting it? Where is it? How do you ensure sovereign governance of it? Of course, in the context of New Zealand, how are you actually doing shared governance with Māori? There's so much more that needs to be taken into account, of course. I was really trying to get to the nub of how to make sure that your ADM systems were operating in those three contexts, in good faith, with integrity, and as expected. So clearly things like that need to come into account as well, for sure.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Pia.
Thank you.
And we'll see you around. People can talk to you later, I'm sure.